A wave of joy in Russia after a thrilling end to a successful World Cup. But after the euphoria, what's next for Moscow and the many challenges it faces at home and abroad? And what lessons for Qatar, the hosts of the next Games in 2022? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. For over a month, people around the world were captivated by a single event, football's World Cup in Russia. The highs of victory and the lows of defeat were shared by millions of fans watching on television and attending the games. And for hosts Russia, it's been a resounding success. FIFA's president called it the best tournament ever. But Russia's government hasn't escaped criticism, especially from rights groups who say it's used the World Cup to distract from challenges at home. We'll have a lot to get to with our guests in just a moment, but first, Rory Challens has this report from Moscow.
The party is almost over. Many of the visitors have gone already, but this country is still glowing. The past month has been a tonic for Russia. Often people here feel the world is against them. Perhaps now that perception is changing.
So we are enjoying the trip, knowing the beautiful places from Russia.
The energy from people is
amazing.
Everything.
Yeah. Have no price to feel that reception to the Brazilians.
Russia is a big, beautiful country. People of Russia are so nice.
A World Cup hasn't erased accusations of Russian authoritarianism, human rights concerns, or the fragility of its economy. But for a while at least, it's allowed Russia to feel positive about itself, without the usual undercurrent of confrontation.
Probably because of our problems, we got drowned in politics and economics, and this championship became a gulp of fresh air. It let us breathe and forget about everything. Next week we'll think about what's happening in our country, but now we're just enjoying the celebration.
Officially, the review is no less positive. FIFA's president Gianni Infantino gave his verdict on Friday, a resounding thumbs up.
I lifted and you lifted. It is the best World Cup ever.
Little went wrong, much went right. Russian policing, not renowned for its soft touch, was on best behaviour. A country that often struggles with infrastructure managed to move fans to matches in cities hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometres apart.
Russia's World Cup may be earning plaudits for its efficient security and organisation, but that, by itself, is not enough for a great party. You also need a little bit of magic, and that happened here on Nikolskaya Street in central Moscow. It spontaneously established itself as the beating heart of this World Cup, a place where Russia and the world got together and had a ball.
Before matches, Russians and foreigners partied hard. After matches, win, lose or draw, they partied harder. Analyst Alexander Baunov thinks there's a big demand for this new mood in Russia.
Russians had been tired to be in this high alert against the rest of the world. They were happy to find in themselves a different side of patriotism. Not the violent side of the patriotism, but that you are able to be patriot and to show your patriotic feeling in hospitality.
Winning hosting rights for the World Cup was important enough for Vladimir Putin that he personally accepted the honour in Zurich in 2010. But interestingly, he's been a marginal figure for much of the tournament. One or two photo ops, attending the opening match and the final. The Kremlin has perhaps realised that heavy-handed official PR is not needed. Putin has left Russians to present their best face to the world, and it's worked. Rory Challens, Al Jazeera, Moscow.
Well, let's bring in our guests now. And joining us from Moscow, Maria Lipman, an independent Russian analyst. From London, Bill Law, founder of Gulf Matters and contributor to Middle East Eye. And also joining us from Moscow via Skype, Rob Harris, a global football writer for the Associated Press news agency. A very warm welcome to all of you. Rob, let me start with you because you've been there in Russia covering the World Cup. You're now at the airport coming to us via Skype because you're just about to leave. Was it the best World Cup ever?
Well, certainly on the pitch, it produced some really thrilling performances, some shocks, some great games that made it sort of an open field. And indeed, that helps the television ratings and it helps to sort of drive up revenue for FIFA. And obviously, the stadiums as well. They were all ready on time. And the Russian state was able to mobilize all its resources to ensure that the right perimeters were in place and the right infrastructure was there around them. So in terms of that, it's going to be hard to judge, though, whether it's the best ever. I think you have to take a long-term view on that in terms of particularly the legacy. Was the investment worth it? Were the stadiums actually used in the long term by regular club sides? And indeed, how do the people react? Are there actually changes in the country as well as a result? Do the relaxation of laws, do they stay in place in the long term? But if you're looking at it from a purely footballing perspective, it was certainly an engrossing tournament.
We will absolutely get to the legacy in just a moment. First of all, Bill, your thoughts. Did anyone expect it to be as good as it was?
Well, in terms of football, no, I don't think so. I thought it was a superb World Cup. In terms of how Russia handled it, I think the Russians did themselves proud. I think that they showed themselves quite adept. They were able to present an image of Russia to the world that was open and hospitable and welcoming. There is another side to Russia, of course, that is the authoritarian side, but Mr. Putin was able to shed that particular garment and put on a much friendlier coat.
Maria, just give us a feeling of what it's been like to feel, what it's felt like to be Russian over these past few weeks and months.
Well, those were amazing weeks with people rejoicing on the streets of Moscow and other cities. And for other cities, it is even more remarkable because in Russia, we have more foreigners and we are more used to international events, of course, not of that scope. What, of course, was totally amazing was these crowds of people speaking in different languages, wrapped up in their national colors, the flags, and painting their faces. And the Russians totally welcoming and as happy as the guests and happy to show Russia as indeed a hospitable and welcoming country. Forgetting that the world was up against Russia, forgetting that that foreigners were enemies, as the national media have announced for at least a few years now. So it was indeed, as I think one Muscovite said in your footage, a gulp of fresh air. It was unlike anything else that we've seen in the past years.
So, Maria, what's closer to the truth, this open, friendly country or the hostile enemy of the West?
Well, I think it's more complicated. No country is just one thing, and it is indeed true that Russia is authoritarian and there are problems, to say the least, with human rights, but it's not the whole thing. And it may be disappointing to human rights activists, but people are not over-focused on human rights. And even those who are could get distracted and actually enjoyed getting distracted and enjoying the World Cup with everybody else. Well, what is the other side of Russia, I think we will be reminded quite soon. It will be interesting to see how the summit between Trump and Putin will go and what the results will be. But of course, the way the Russian people were readjusted to being open and rejoicing and happy to welcome, to host foreigners from all over the world shows that, in fact, it is also there. It just depends on what the environment is and whether people are under pressure or not. They were not for the weeks of the World Cup.
Rob, how much do you think it helped, should I say, that Putin took very much a back seat during this World Cup? He was there at the beginning and he was there at the end, but not much in the middle. And in the beginning, in the run-up to the event, it was called Putin's Cup, but it really wasn't, was it?
Well, he wasn't at very many games. He's not known to be a particularly big football fan, but he was there front and centre enough for him to basically get the reflected glory, I think, of certainly the success, with some saying it was a PR coup for Russia, the fact they managed to detoxify the image. You have human rights groups who say, actually, that's a matter of sports cleansing, the fact you're using a sports event to hopefully distract people from some of the issues that persist. But the fact he actually stayed away, did not keep the politics away from this World Cup, and even at the final, which Greece did attend, you had the Sudanese president, a man who was charged with genocide and crimes against humanity, was there amongst the VVIP areas. So that just shows how it's very hard to detach the politics from the football. But I think you probably recognise that during a World Cup, people just want to actually focus on the games, and the matches do take over, and the thrills, the spills, the likes of Spain struggling, the holders, Germany going out in the group stage, and it really ensures that the actual players and other stars, and indeed the fans and the local Russians, because they were the front and face of this World Cup for the likes of myself, who were going around to cities, in many cases, cities that were closed cities during Soviet times, who aren't used to a big influx of foreigners, and you did seem to be very welcoming.
Bill, do you think that once the euphoria has rubbed off, we're going to have a bit of a hard landing in Russia? And how hard that's going to be? Or will this positive vibe be able to carry Russians through for a little bit longer?
Well, I suspect it's going to be a return to what Russia was, a few weeks ago, which is a hardline authoritarian state where critics are dealt with, dissidence is discouraged. I think the issues that Russia faces haven't gone away. The economic issues are very big and troubling for many Russians. I think that, they've had this opportunity to enjoy this World Cup, and good on them. It's been a fantastic few weeks. But I do think that those problems they haven't disappeared. They're still there. They're real, and Mr. Putin, regardless of what he accomplishes with Donald Trump, is still going to have to deal with them. It's a question of how he deals with them, and I suspect he will deal with them as he has done in the past, which is to attempt to silence all criticism.
And when it comes to the economy, has there been much of a boost seen by ordinary Russians because of this World Cup?
Well, I think, yes, I'm sure that the economy has taken a bounce up. But again, that's a short-term fix. Clearly, there was a lot of beer and alcohol that vendors who benefited from this World Cup, and lots of souvenirs and kit and all those sorts of proceeds. The big winner in this, I suspect, is FIFA in terms of the financial gain. I don't think that it's going to have a lasting economic impact. I could stand to be corrected on that, but that's my interpretation.
Rob, the stadiums, Putin promised that there'd be sustainable homes to vibrant football clubs. Was that a sense that you got? I mean, some of these stadiums are in very sort of remote places, aren't they? Very far from Moscow.
Yeah, I mean, they are scattered around the country. I'm thinking to one in Samara that was built right into the middle of a forest, and some of them do not have top flight clubs. They might have a team in the second division, which means it's hard to fill them when they've got tens of thousands of seats and perhaps not the audience there. And then we've even seen in Volgograd yesterday, just as the final was taking place, some sort of mudslide around the stadium, which obviously maybe they didn't quite foresee next to the water there. But that is generally the problem in Russia and in many of these World Cups on their stage in countries that require a lot of infrastructure to be built. The fact it isn't necessarily needed in the long term, particularly all these stadia with vast hospitality facilities. And obviously the questions many Russians will have, could the money be put to better use spent on infrastructure away from football?
Maria, are there a lot of questions within Russia as to why so much money was spent on stadiums and, as Rob said, so much hospitality infrastructure surrounding them?
Well, I think this is not something that will be questioned, and there is a very strong limit to how accountable the Russian government is to its people. In fact, I would say that it's not. I think people are happy in those cities where new stadiums were built or old stadiums were upgraded. These will be the places for people to use. And I think the Russian people in general think that the expenses, even if they are very high, were worth it. Much worse than on other issues that big expenditures are allocated by the government. People did have fun, and they will have wonderful memories. And I don't think expenditures will be an issue. And I agree that it will not give a boost to the economy, certainly not.
OK. And we touched earlier on the human rights issues, Maria. I mean, Human Rights Watch says that the World Cup was a lost opportunity, that football's governing body could have used the event as some form of leverage over the Kremlin. Do you agree with that?
Well, no, I don't think so. I think we should look at these things separate. Indeed, any country is several things at the same time. It's not totally focused on one and not the other. And especially a country as large and diverse as Russia has all of it. It has people who are really happy to be open to the world and to enjoy the grand event and to show the openness. And by the way, in his opening words, before the World Cup, Putin said, we open our country and we open our hearts to you. And in a sense, this was true for those weeks. But at the same time, there is politics, and there is domestic politics, and there's a crackdown on freedoms and liberties. Of course, there is a very, very difficult problem of the relations with the West. If the recent NATO summit is any indication, the perception of Russia has not changed because of this extremely successful World Cup. The NATO summit was held during the World Cup, and the final statement of that summit is absolutely the same as far as the perception of Russia in the West is concerned. A list of accusations, Russia seen as a threat, the West totally unwilling to recognize that any responsibility for the current confrontation, dangerous confrontation, is on the West itself.
Okay, let's throw the discussion forward to 2022. Russia's President Vladimir Putin has passed the ball to the next World Cup host, Qatar. Now, the country's leader, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, joined Putin and FIFA's president at an official handover ceremony at the Kremlin on Sunday. Qatar will be the first country in the Middle East to host the World Cup, and the Games will be held in the cooler months of November and December. The Qatari Emir says he's confident that 2022 will be a success. But Qatar has been under an economic blockade for more than a year. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt and Bahrain cut diplomatic ties last June, yet organisers say this has had very little impact on preparations. Joanna Gajarowska has more.
Lusail Stadium over here will host both the opening game and the final, and when it's finished in around 2 years' time, it will seat around 80,000 spectators. Now, with the tournament being moved to December, it also means those fans will avoid the kind of summer heat that we're experiencing today. As part of its winning bid, Qatar promised to take apart many of the stadiums at the end of the World Cup and send sections to developing countries to help them grow the game. Of course, that's only part of the legacy. Qatar's leaders and World Cup organisers are still hoping football can bring this region closer together.
Now, Rob, what lessons should Qatar take away from Russia? Because Qatar's hosting also has quite a lot of controversy attached to it.
Well, I think actually one of the main things is ensuring fans actually have something to do. I think a lot of fans were surprised in Russia by the ability to see new sights, to travel the country and to experience new things. So actually, it is actually keeping them entertained, knowing that perhaps there aren't as much tourist infrastructure in Qatar as well. There will be questions, obviously, as always, about the availability of alcohol. But then in Russia, even there are actually restrictions in place. But it is actually about the travel, which I think fans will notice in Qatar. In Russia, it's been very challenging at times. All flights have had to go through Moscow, even when you're scattered around the country. And perhaps the big thing that fans will notice, obviously, in Qatar is the fact that you don't have to fly anywhere. And actually, logistically, it should be simpler for them.
Absolutely. I mean, the big question is, how do you keep all these people entertained? And Bill, does Qatar have what it takes to be as amazing as it's promising?
Well, I think, Laura, that's the big challenge that Doha and Qatar faces. I mean, the thing about Russia was that, yes, fans from approached it with some trepidation, some concerns about hooliganism. But when they got there, they found the Russians very welcoming, very opening. So that was a pleasant surprise. And yes, the travel was challenging, but they got to see this enormous country. And it was exciting. I think the difficulty with Doha, and I don't want to knock the city. It's got some fabulous architecture. It's got a wonderful museum of Islamic art. But there isn't that much going on. And if you think about British tourists who go to Dubai, they get the full treatment in terms of all of the available tourist sites. I'm not sure that Doha has the same capabilities. I think that's going to be a real issue. And the alcohol, as Rob mentioned, that's another issue. One can't imagine a World Cup without gallons and gallons of beer being consumed by by fans, particularly, I dare say, English fans. So yeah, I think there are going to be big challenges on that front. I think it's going to be a challenge too in terms of the football, because if you think about it, they're playing in November and December. That's going to really interrupt the professional leagues, the Premier League, for example. A lot of players went to Russia from the Premier League, and I'm not sure that fans here are going to be that tickled about seeing their teams and their seasons disrupted by this a solution to the issue of the heat in the summer, moving it into November and December.
Rob, would it have made a difference, do you think, if they'd made a joint regional bid, something like we're seeing in 2026, the US, Canada and Mexico, if we'd had some kind of region-wide World Cup in 2022?
I think that was very much thought in amongst the genesis of the discussions before they actually launched the bid, but I don't think people were too keen on it. So obviously it did lead to this singular Qatar bid. A joint bid across the region would actually help to spread the burden of the stadiums. I think a lot of people do question why and if Qatar needs to spend the money building so many stadiums when it does not have the need for them necessarily afterwards. Obviously, what the organisers say is some of them will be broken down and some of the parts of them will be spread out, particularly in parts of Africa. But actually, the building is not required. And also, there is stress on the logistics and infrastructure in Qatar. The fact there is only the one airport, and there are, really the hotels around Doha, and the area is going to have to be built up to accommodate tens of thousands of fans and the teams and the officials. Whereas actually, that burden would have been spread out across the region, and perhaps, who knows, maybe the issues that we've seen in the last year with the boycotts by the neighbours would not have happened if they were actually all part of a unified World Cup project that they had to deliver in 2022.
Yeah, that's quite a thought, isn't it? Maria, one other controversy is, of course, migrant workers' rights. There was a similar issue being faced in Russia, wasn't there? I mean, did the spotlight being shone on the workers' rights, especially the construction workers who were building the stadiums, did that make any difference?
Well, actually, as a matter of fact, the problem of migrant workers in Russia has become less acute in recent years, and I would say less acute than it is in Europe right now. Thing is that we had this problem, and I'm sorry to say racial, ethnic sentiments were really high, and I'm talking here about 2013, for instance, when the mayoral election in Moscow were along the racial lines, both as far as the incumbent campaign is concerned and that of his opponent. But since then, well, for two reasons, one of them being that the Russian economy in general is on decline, so we need less migrant workforce, and they have become less of an irritant to people in big urban centers. And the other is the annexation of Crimea, which kind of overshadowed the ethnic nationalism and replaced it by state nationalism, or call it imperial nationalism, as you like. So the sentiment, the negative sentiment toward people with different appearance, different features, different colors, have not been that acute.
Bill, just in the last minute that we have, the euphoria of the event rubs off. Do we see a return then to all the major issues that Russia faces when it looks out at the world?
Yeah, I think we do. I think that Russia will still have to contend with all of those issues, and the world and Europe will have to contend with Russia. The challenges haven't gone away. The World Cup was a respite. It was a break. We all enjoyed it. Terrific. But the real world comes back in and intervenes. And there are many, many issues, many areas of friction, not least of which is Syria. And during the World Cup, the Russians and Bashar Assad, they secured a significant victory, which consolidates Assad and really secures him in the long term as the Syrian leader. These are not times that are going to go away. Those issues, those frictions will remain. And I think that football is something you enjoy for the time, but the real world comes back and will continue to challenge us.
And indeed, enjoyable for a time it was. Many thanks indeed for our guests for joining us today, Maria Lipman, Bill Law and Rob Harris. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.